August 1944. After the breakout from Normandy, German defenses were collapsing faster than anyone expected. Abandoned positions, scattered columns of equipment, captured supply depots. The front was unraveling. Among all Allied armies, only one moved faster than the rest: George Patton's Third Army. After-action reports show his corps covering tens of miles each day. Tank divisions surged across shattered bridges, engineers built crossings on the fly, and staff officers struggled to update maps. Reports read almost casually. Organized resistance is minimal. German units were retreating, often without orders, trying simply to escape encirclement. At that moment, a crucial question emerged. What to do next? Push east toward Germany or swing north to Paris? Patton's diary from August 1944 reveals what few understood at the time. A rare opportunity had opened. If his army continued without pause, tanks could reach the Rhine while the Germans were still disorganized. Victory could come faster than anyone imagined. But war isn't only strategy. Politics also mattered. Paris, the symbol of France, remained under German control. The French resistance was active, tensions were rising, and Charles de Gaulle insisted, according to his war memoirs, that French forces must liberate the city themselves. Not Americans, not British, the French. For de Gaulle, this was a matter of legitimacy for the future of France. For Patton, it was a potential disaster. Meanwhile, logistics became the invisible enemy. Third Army's advance outran its supply lines. Fuel shortages, stalled convoys, and delays in moving units are documented in Transportation Corps records. The Red Ball Express, the famous supply highway, was increasingly diverted to support operations around Paris. Eisenhower's correspondence reflects the compromise. Priority, Paris. For Patton, this meant slowing the advance. On the German side, relief quietly spread. Post-war interrogations of German generals revealed that the pause gave them time to reorganize, retreat, and prepare defenses, a chance they desperately needed. One logistics officer later testified that without those few days, many units would have faced complete destruction. Patton's diary entry from that week is brief, yet haunting. We could have gone further. A single week and the course of the Western Front began to shift. During that time, Third Army staff documented each hour. Tank divisions that had surged forward now waited for fuel. Engineers who had built crossings on the move were reassigned to maintenance tasks. Communication lines reported, movement halted pending orders. The map showed a frozen moment. Troops ready, enemy retreating, yet progress stopped. Across the front, Möldl, recently appointed to command German forces in the west, focused on the impossible, to salvage what remained of shattered divisions. Post-war interrogations reveal that in these days they began reassembling units, reinforcing defensive positions, and stabilizing the front. The pause had given them exactly what they needed. On the Allied side, attention shifted to Paris. Supplies and planning flowed into the city. Each convoy, each drop of fuel diverted from Third Army, meant fewer resources for Patton's advance. And as the days passed, the Germans quietly began to rebuild the defenses that would later be called the Siegfried Line. For Patton, the halt was more than frustration. His diary shows he calculated the cost in lost time and momentum. He feared the enemy would escape behind fortified positions, turning a war of movement into a grinding battle of attrition. But orders were orders, and even the fiery Patton obeyed. History would later judge this pause differently depending on perspective. For de Gaulle, it ensured French legitimacy. For the Germans, it bought precious time. For the Americans, it became a moment of lost opportunity. This was the week that changed the momentum of the Western Front, where politics and logistics collided with strategy, and where the fastest-moving army of the Allies was forced to pause just as victory seemed within reach. By mid-August 1944, the map of Western Europe seemed straightforward. Allied arrows advancing, Germany retreating. But at headquarters, the reality was far more complicated. Eisenhower's desk was flooded with conflicting reports. On one hand, Third Army reported, "We can keep moving." On the other hand, supply officers warned of stretched fuel lines, delays in transport, and the growing risk that forward units could be cut off from support. Every day mattered. Meanwhile, the city of Paris simmered with tension. The French resistance staged uprisings, sabotaged German operations, and called for immediate liberation. Charles de Gaulle made his position clear in his memoirs. If French forces were not allowed to enter Paris first, the legitimacy of the post-war government could be compromised, leaving radical factions to seize control. This was no mere political posturing, it was a demand with consequences. Allied command debated the matter relentlessly. Letters and memos from Eisenhower reveal his dual concerns. First, preventing an uncontrolled urban revolt in the French capital, and second, ensuring political stability in liberated France. The decision was made: Paris must be liberated by French forces, and that meant diverting resources, fuel, vehicles, personnel, away from Patton's Third Army. For Patton, this was a direct break on his offensive. August after-action reports describe stationary columns, idle tanks, and stalled communications. On the front map, a pause had appeared. Troops stood ready, the enemy was retreating, yet the advance had halted. This pause, however, was a lifeline for the Germans. Newly appointed Field Marshal Walter Model faced a seemingly impossible task: to stabilize a shattered army and prepare for further defense. Post-war interrogations reveal that these few days allowed German units to regroup, reinforce defensive positions, and restore command structures. Without the pause, many units would have been annihilated. At the same time, logistics and planning for Paris consumed vast Allied resources. Fuel, ammunition, and personnel were redirected to the city. Convoys that could have sustained Patton's eastward push were now allocated to support French forces entering the capital. Every ton of fuel, every vehicle, every truck meant one less resource for maintaining the Third Army's momentum. Reconnaissance reports began to show the first signs of change. Villages, previously lightly defended, now had organized positions. Anti-tank obstacles were rebuilt. Artillery crews returned to positions once abandoned. The open road to the Rhine was disappearing. For both sides, the decision seemed logical. Allies acted to secure political objectives and moral authority. Germans seized the reprieve to prepare a defensible line. But the consequences were already becoming clear: lost initiative, stronger enemy positions, and months of slower, bloodier combat ahead. Within Third Army, tension grew. Patton's personal diary entries capture the frustration of commanders who understood the opportunity slipping away. They had witnessed shattered German units just days before, believing victory was within reach. Now, with the pause, the enemy was regrouping, and the path eastward was no longer clear. This week-long stop would later be scrutinized by historians, debated by military analysts, and questioned in memoirs. The pause that seemed minor at the time would prove decisive, not in the liberation of Paris, which was successful, but in the tempo of the war that followed. As August drew on, Patton's tanks remained poised, ready to strike, yet the enemy was no longer fleeing blindly. The momentary stillness on the map concealed a profound shift. The Germans were preparing to fight again, fortified, organized, and ready to turn what seemed like a retreat into a line of defense that would challenge the Allies for months to come. The contrast was stark. In Paris, the French flag would soon fly over liberated streets. On the front lines, Patton's army waited. And across the Rhine, German soldiers quietly rebuilt a defensive wall that would soon test the resolve and courage of every Allied soldier. History would remember it as a week of pause, but it was far more than that. It was the week that allowed the enemy time they desperately needed, and the moment that the momentum of the war began to shift. When historians say, "Paris saved Germany," it sounds dramatic, but the documents tell a cold, factual story. Every hour Patton's Third Army waited was an hour Germany needed to recover. Supply reports show fuel and vehicles rerouted to Paris. Each ton of fuel, each truck diverted, slowed the eastward advance. Engineers rebuilt positions, artillery crews returned, and scattered units were reorganized into battalions. Post-war interrogations of German officers make the stakes clear. One logistics officer testified, "Without that pause, we could not have held the front." For a military accustomed to fast maneuvers and decisive blows, the days of waiting allowed Germany's fragmented forces to regain coherence. Meanwhile, Patton's diary entries reflect mounting frustration. He calculated the lost days and foresaw the consequences. The Germans would use the time to consolidate, transforming what had been a war of movement into one of attrition and prepared defenses. His units were ready to strike, but the orders were to pause. The Allies were not idle in Paris. French forces coordinated with resistance units. Supplies, planning, and reinforcements were funneled into the city. Every diversion to Paris came at a cost. Fewer resources for Patton's tanks, less fuel for a push east. Reconnaissance revealed the first signs of change along the German lines. Villages were fortified, anti-tank obstacles were rebuilt, and the first sections of the Siegfried Line, once partially dismantled, were being remanned. What had appeared as an open road to the Rhine was now slowly closing. The consequences of the pause became even more evident in the days that followed. Patton's Third Army, which had once surged past German units, now faced reconstituted divisions ready to resist. Reports document new artillery placements, obstacles along roads, and restored command structures. Where German forces had been scattered and demoralized, they were now organized and reinforced. The decisions on both sides appeared rational. Allies prioritized political and symbolic objectives, liberating Paris with French forces at the forefront. Germans used the time to prepare and stabilize the front. But the result was clear. The Allied advantage in momentum was diminished, and the cost in time and resources was mounting. The post-war testimony of Walter Model's officers confirms what the report suggested. The pause, while brief, was critical. It allowed German units to avoid destruction, recover equipment, and occupy defensive positions that had been almost abandoned. One officer noted, "The pause was the difference between annihilation and survival." Patton's diary entries reveal the human side of this operational pause: frustration, anxiety, and a constant awareness that opportunity was slipping away. He wrote of the open roads ahead, the scattered German units, and the chance to reach the Rhine before the enemy could regroup. Those days could not be reclaimed. As the days passed, the balance of power subtly shifted. The open spaces that had allowed American armor to maneuver freely were closing. The Germans were no longer retreating blindly, they were prepared. Each fortified village, each repaired defensive line, meant a slower, more costly advance. By the end of the week, the tactical reality was clear. Political objectives had been achieved. Paris was soon to be liberated, but the operational tempo on the Western Front had been irreversibly altered. Patton's army, once poised for a decisive drive, was now facing a reorganized enemy, fortified positions, and the beginning of a long and bloody campaign into Germany. The week-long pause illustrates a fundamental truth about war. Even a few days can change the course of battles, the fate of armies, and the strategy of entire campaigns. By the time Patton's tanks resumed their advance, the consequences of the pause were already clear and documented. Third Army after-action reports from September 1944 show that German positions had been reinforced, artillery redeployed, and engineering units completed fortifications. The fuel, vehicles, and personnel that could have propelled the advance eastward had been redirected to Paris. Each diverted resource represented a loss in momentum that could not be recovered. Post-war interrogations of German officers confirm the critical impact of those few days. Walter Model's staff testified that the pause had allowed shattered German divisions to regroup, reorganize, and occupy defensive positions. Units once considered destroyed were now operational. Without the week-long delay, Model admitted, the Allied advance could have overrun them before they had a chance to consolidate. The pause, while brief, had bought the Germans time they desperately needed. For Patton, the cost was personal as well as operational. His diaries and personal papers record a growing awareness that the opportunity for a swift, decisive push into Germany had been squandered. He wrote of roads that had been open, enemy units that had been scattered, and the chance to reach the Rhine before the enemy could recover. That chance, he realized, was gone forever. The consequences were also numerical. Historians and analysts estimate that the resulting slowing of the Allied advance, caused in part by the diversion of resources to Paris, contributed to roughly 80,000 additional American casualties in subsequent battles. These were not losses in the liberation of Paris itself, which proceeded largely as planned, but in the prolonged and more difficult fighting required to breach the reorganized German defenses further east. The documents tell a clear story. The pause was a deliberate, politically motivated choice. Letters from Eisenhower and staff discussions show concern over French legitimacy, post-war stability, and the morale impact of allowing French forces to liberate their own capital. At the same time, Third Army reports repeatedly highlight the cost in terms of lost momentum and fuel shortages. Each convoy sent to Paris was a convoy that could have supported Patton's tanks on the eastern push. Reconnaissance and intelligence reports from the same period detail the German response. Villages that had been undefended were fortified. Anti-tank obstacles were rebuilt, and artillery crews returned to their positions. Where American units had previously seen open roads, they now faced a line of prepared defenses, later recognized as part of the Siegfried Line. The pause had transformed a temporary opportunity into a prolonged, costly campaign. The contrast is striking. In Paris, French forces raised the tricolor and celebrated liberation. On the front lines, Patton's army waited, watching German forces that had once been in full retreat, now forming organized defenses. The operational advantage had shifted subtly but irreversibly. History records it as a week of pause, but it was more than that. It was a week that allowed the enemy to survive, recover, and reorganize. It was a week that changed the tempo of the war on the Western Front. And it was a week that demonstrated the complex interaction between political decisions and battlefield realities. How the liberation of a city, a symbol of a nation, could cost thousands of lives and alter the course of a campaign. Patton's words from the time encapsulate the tension of those days. We could have gone further. The opportunity was ours, but the orders were not mine to give. That week remains a powerful reminder that in war, timing is everything, and even a short delay can reshape the fate of armies, nations, and history itself.